Hey everyone, it's Primer. Today we'll leave off exactly where we left off on part 1, so if you haven't watched that yet, please do that first. In this video, we'll talk about when and where haste spells are used, and then go through a bunch of examples to put them into practice. Since I couldn't fit everything in this video, part 3 will cover the Warden, free spells, and some more practice for everything to review what we've learned so far. I will also be finally covering the Sui in a future video, something that's super important, but something I haven't really said much about yet. Anyways, let's dive right into the video. I have two guidelines for haste spells. The first rule is that you want to be hasting defenses, not loons. What I mean is, you shouldn't spend one whole spell space just hasting loons into one single defense, like I'm doing here into the scatter. And that's a pretty common mistake I used to do myself. Instead, you want loons to be hasted across as many defenses as possible. And note that you don't want the haste to be covering the center of each defense, but actually where the loons stop on the defenses, which is right on the edge of each defense. And since the haste does not wear off even when you leave the radius for a second or so, using hastes this way maximizes the time loons are under the haste effect. As a rule of thumb, try to have at least 3 defenses in each haste. This can be best explained with an example. Take a look at how I'm using my haste spells here. I first decided to use my first haste spell at 3 o'clock, because it covers 3 buildings: the bomb tower, the single tower, and the wizard tower. And since the wizard tower is positioned correct, the haste spell is positioned correctly, it means that the loons are actually hasted into the scatter as well. And so this is exactly what you want. And again, the same thing for the rage spell. I'm covering 4 buildings here, and so that the loons are hasted for as long as the time as possible. And finally, my third haste, which covers the multi-mortar, the air defense, and the cannon. And again, I'm positioning it so that it's hasted into all those defenses and even into the scatter. Although I do hit a tornado here actually, which does mess up a bit, but the idea is the same. The last haste honestly isn't too good, right? Maybe I could have delayed it a little more to cover the single and the cannon, but in this case it doesn't really matter because there's no base left. The second rule is as follows. To get the most value out of your hastes, you want to haste through the areas of the highest DPS to minimize the time the loons take heavy damage. This often means hasting the loons more of the Lalo need to take out the eagle as fast as possible, hasting the scatters infernos, and so on. But this isn't always the case. And again, don't take this to the extreme, like just by hasting into just one single scattered defense, right? Don't break the first rule. So if we take a look at the space, I'm planning to use the slammer to take out the 9 o'clock scatter, so that's not going to be a problem. So if you were to imagine that out of the way, you notice that the main sources of DPS will be the scatter and the town hall. And so without breaking the first rule, this leads me to think, okay, I'm probably going to have to use my hastes earlier than later this time. I'll probably try to haste into the scatter, haste into town as possible to get those both defenses down as fast as possible, as you can see here. And yet, take a look how I'm still making sure the hastes still follow the rule that I'm trying to cover as many defenses as possible, which in this case is the wizard tower, the air defense, the cannon, and then again a second haste that covers the cannon, the expo, the scatter, and the cannon. And now I use my third haste pretty soon afterwards because the only defense that really has some problems is the town hall. And so I want to hasten into town hall and yet still follow my rule of thumb, right? Hasting into the bomb tower, the air defense, and then into the town hall. And by doing this, I get the high DPS defenses down as quickly as possible, which is exactly what you need to do. And so in this case, I do have 1 rage spell left, and again, I'm waiting to place my rage spell so it covers as many defenses as possible, although at this point it doesn't really matter because there's not much base left. With this base, I want to introduce 2 concepts. First, notice that at 3 o'clock, a bunch of Teslas pop up. So I see this as an opportunity to use a haste because I can haste like 5 defenses, and that's a lot of value. And so I decided to invest in a haste there, even though I wasn't originally planning to. The second is you notice the sweeper at 11 o'clock pushing on my loons at 1. And if I don't haste into the sweeper, my loons will definitely lag behind too much. And so you definitely should haste into sweepers almost all the time, unless in very special occasions where there's no DPS. Otherwise, it will really mess up your pathing, as the loons will be keep getting pushed back, and then it causes them to lag behind from the other groups. If you have a Lalo plant on a base where most of the Lalo is just one big funnel shape, perhaps sometimes like Laloing straight into the core, where you don't really have many secondary groups and just have this one big main group, what's generally a good idea to do is to use the haste spells earlier, and actually mostly in parallel like this. And so somewhere roughly like this, because you want to haste earlier. With the main group this thin, right, since it's so wide, they need more support, especially if there's more DPS in the beginning. And so it's usually a good idea to use haste like this, as opposed to saving them for later, because if you try to save them for later, they're just going to thin out in the beginning and die almost immediately. So if we take a look at an example of this, right, in this case, the funnel shape is relatively wide, and so I'm using haste spells very early on to haste all my main group of loons in. I'm still abiding by the rules though. I'm still abiding by that. I'm still hasting into 3 or more, sometimes 4 or 5 defenses. So I'm still getting great value out of them. But I am also still trying to use them earlier. Right, in this case, it made more sense to use a haste spell earlier than as opposed to right now. In which case, right now, there's barely any DPS. They're already all clumping. So they're a lot more powerful and don't need a haste spell as much. And even though we're approaching a multi and an air defense, they're already clumped up, meaning that they have a lot more HP together, they're all tanking each other, and don't really need a haste. The final concept associated with haste spells is that haste spells do mess up or change the timing of different groups of loons, especially between the main and secondary groups. To go for a more abstract example, imagine that we have a bunch of loons coming in parallel. And so they're all just moving forward ahead together. And let's say that at some point we decide to haste more on the right side. Maybe like this. And so what happens is that the right side will start going faster and move ahead of the left group, meaning that the right side will start taking out more defenses while the left side lags behind a bit. And so what actually will happen is that this will cause the loons to pivot and kind of change the general direction and turn more to the left. And in some other cases, this could also mean if you're hasting the main group, and that means the secondary groups come or arrive relatively later because your main groups start taking up more buildings, or if you haste your secondary groups, then that means your secondary groups might surge ahead of your main group. And so these are all factors you have to consider when you're using haste spells. And now in this example I used right here, with hasting one side, this can be a useful tool if you want perhaps the loons to turn more to some particular direction, or if the main group is heading toward a direction you don't want, you can perhaps use this to try to force them in some direction. You also have to be careful that when you're using your haste spells, you're not messing up your secondary and main groups. Remember how we talked about how you want your secondary groups to kind of join in with the main group and have to pay very close attention to the timing of your secondary groups? Well, you have to factor in the use of haste spells. So if you're planning to use a haste spell on a secondary group, that might mean you might want to send the secondary group a little later, since they'll be moving faster. Or if you're planning to haste your main group, maybe that means you send your secondary groups a little earlier to plan for the fact that the main group will be moving faster. And again, with more examples like that. So perhaps to demonstrate, let's take a look at this attack, which you may have seen before. And so for now, it's fine, right? Again, we have this funnel shape that's drawn a bit like this. Whoops. A bit like this. And as we watch, again, this is working the way we expect. That's fine. Maybe I'll fast forward this part a little bit. However, the first thing is I'm using my first haste spell right here, which is fine. That does not break a rule, right? We want to haste into defenses. In this case, if we haste right here, this will haste into 4 defenses, which is exactly what we want here. But now the loons are heading much too much to the right. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to haste here, which number one does not break the rules. But number two also makes it so that the main group heads more to the left. And so for these two combined reasons, I decided to haste around 3 o'clock. And so now the loons on the right side move faster, which also causes everything to converge more to the left side. And so this is something you can do. However, do not rely on this. What I mean by this is it's better to just start your secondary groups earlier than to rely on hasting to change the path and change the direction of your loons. If you find yourself having to haste too much to control the direction of your loons, consider reworking your timing of your secondary groups. Maybe you're sending your secondary groups just too late, and maybe you should just send them a bit earlier instead of having to keep wasting haste spells on them. You use a rage spell instead of a haste spell for your Lalo for on some area under two conditions. 1. To one-shot high HP defenses like the Town Hall or Eagle. Notice here that I'm still placing my rage to cover multiple defenses. And 2. To deal with the enemy heroes faster. For example, to boost your headhunters, skelly spells, or minions in killing the enemy heroes. What I'd like to do now is to go over a full example focusing on haste spells to put this theory into practice and try to see how we would apply this to an actual base from start to finish. So in this case, my plan is just to sui the Town Hall. I'm trying to actually go for the scatter as well, and because that scatter will really mess up my Lalo pathing, so I really need to get my sui using the RC to take out the multi. And so once all of that stuff is done, and again, this is not too important, we're not focusing on this, we have the Lalo. And so maybe I'll pause here. And so if we take a look at our shape, it looks a bit like this. And so since the shape is already pretty good for Lalo, I decided just to use a slammer because there's not really a place I really need to use a blimp to force pathing. So I just thought, okay, I'm just going to use a slammer to take out the expo. But more importantly, let's draw out the funnel shape to determine what's the main group and what's the secondary groups. So in this case, the main group looks a bit like this. Again, I'm not including the expo because the slammer will get it here, that's fine. And then on this side, we look something like this, right? Because we want everything to go to the scatter. Meaning we do have our secondary groups here, right? These are the defenses our secondary groups need to directly target. And we have our main group, which will deploy it instantaneously. And so again, it's really helpful to do this because this will give us insight on the timing of our secondary groups. And if specifically in this context, that can perhaps give us some guidance to maybe how we need to use our haste spells as well. And so maybe the first thing to take a look at is the DPS of the base, right? So of course we've got a scatter, we've got a multi, and we've got an eagle, and then we've got our enemy queen here. These are kind of the important buildings. Maybe I'll mark these on with a different color: the scatter, the eagle, the queen, and the multi. We do also have the sweeper, which can prove a little annoying, and as we mentioned earlier, sweepers can really mess up the Lalo pathing. And so since the sweeper will be beating alongside this way, the loons will always tend to go in this direction because that's where the sweeper is pointing, which means we'll probably need to speed up our loons somewhat in this area to really force the loons downwards and kind of fight the sweeper. Force the loons to stay in the funnel shape. Otherwise, the sweeper will knock the main group outside the funnel shape. So okay, so that's one thing to consider. We'll probably need to haste our rage somewhere along there. Second thing is we've got this eagle and we've got this queen, and they're right next to each other. This is a perfect place for a rage because first thing is that the rage makes the loons one-shot the eagle. Second is that it can get the enemy queen down faster, especially since we have two headhunters, especially since if one gets sprung and so on and so forth, or even both get sprung. A rage is crucial to help get that queen down as fast as possible, and so that, because if she stays up, we're screwed. There's no way we triple. And now that we know we're going to use a rage there, we realize that this rage can be a great place to counter that sweeper as well. So we want our spells to do stuff like this. We want our spells to have multi-tasks, right? In this case, our rage accomplishes three things. One, it fights sweeper. Second, it one-shots eagle. And the third, it fights the queen. The more we do this type of thing, the more value we can get out of our hastes and out of our rages. We know we have a multi here. And so, with this multi, maybe it's a good idea we can haste into this multi, because there's not many other places where we have to haste, right? Again, we're trying to haste into higher DPS, and there's no town hall or anything, so maybe this multi is a good choice. And so maybe we can haste around here, right? Trying to get more deep buildings, maybe here if we want, or maybe here if we want, trying to include as many defenses as possible with the haste. So that's a possibility as well. We'd probably have to freeze the multi. Again, this type of thing, we're just trying to get the rough idea because we will have to react when we're actually hitting the base. We don't want to completely plan out our spells. That should be something we never do, because if we do that, it's very inflexible. Lots of things can go on at Lalo, and there's so many things that happen that a lot of it is reaction time. However, we do want to get a general sense of what we want to do so that when we actually hit the base, we have some idea of what we need to do, even though we're still reacting. Okay, so maybe we can use the haste there. That's something to consider. Is there any other place? Well, for now, not too sure yet. I mean, it will really depend on the Lalo itself. Really depends on how the loons act, how much the sweepers are prom, and so forth. So for now, we have some general ideas of what we want to do. So maybe we'll just hit the base and see what happens. So I'm going to now watch. Now I'm going to play this in slow motion. And the queen got everything she should. So the minions are starting to clean up, and I'm going to start my slammer. One thing is that maybe I should let my slammer do a little more work. In this case, I set my Lalo super early so that slammer doesn't really do much work. And again, I talked about the downsides of the slammer in the past. But anyways, this loon is taking a while. Let's get that slammer going. And now the Lalo is back. So again, the main group is first, and the secondary groups need to come pretty early. And so now here's where I make my first mistake. Take a look at my first haste spell placement. Instead of using it where I talked about with the multi, I instead use it at 12 o'clock. Now take a look at 12 o'clock here. What defenses am I covering? I'm pretty much just covering the cannon and barely would start, and that's it. And I don't really need to, right? In this case, I should have just sent my secondary groups a little earlier instead of wasting a haste spell, and should have just used it for this multi. But anyways, the rage spell is good, right? This rage spell makes so that the eagle goes down quickly, the minions and the headhunters make quick work of the queen. So this is great, and the rage also nullifies the effects of the sweeper. And now here's my next haste spell. This is a good haste spell. In this case, first, there's lots of splashers, so we're starting a Tesla, so we want to get through that. And second, is this is getting a lot of value, right? Like 5 buildings inside the haste. And third, we need to clear these buildings faster so that all the loons converge on this side. And so from that, this haste has like 3 different functions, and it's why it's a great haste, as opposed to my first haste, which was kind of swagged and should have been used with the multi. Now this third haste I don't really need because this base is going to triple anyways, but I'm just going to drop it to cover all the rest of the buildings, and therefore this base is a nice triple. This concludes part 2 of the Lalo execution guide, focusing on haste spells. Stay tuned on the final part, which will come out soon. See you then.